I do encourage now the participants of the next panel of the plenary session to stay on stage, because we are about to begin with an opening plenary confronting global threats, standing up for integrity. All of the delegates are there, and the session will be moderated by Anna Therese Day. Anna, the floor is yours now. Thank you for being with us here.
Okay. Thank you, Givile, and hello to my absolute favorite community of frontline human rights defenders, fearless anti-corruption fighters, visionary thought leaders, Herculean world builders, and principled public servants from all over the world. I want to again thank our Lithuanian hosts, not only for their hospitality, but also for modeling the values we're here to strengthen and expand, as well as for their openness and transparency about the challenges faced by our allies here. It's lost on no one who looked at a map as thousands of us flew in that all the battles we're fighting everywhere face an added layer of risk here, given the looming security realities and painful fates of Lithuania's neighbors. So I couldn't be more pleased to have leaders on this opening panel who are in the trenches of these fights with valuable tactics and strategies that can and must be adapted and applied well beyond Europe with equal urgency and equitable support. I couldn't be more thrilled to be hosting our opening featuring other global leaders from all over the world who are investing in grassroots solutions our frontline colleagues invent every day, with every new challenge and often against all odds, and sometimes paying the ultimate price. Currently, nowhere is this ultimate sacrifice more clearly on display than with the record killings of our frontline Palestinian colleagues and their families, at unfathomable accelerated rates over the past 8 months. But of course, this spiral into new unthinkable rings of hell is simply the latest chapter in the still stateless Palestinian people's over half a century of abuse. Abuse is never defense, and I'm relieved to be in a room of professionals who understand atrocities don't justify further atrocities, and that standing with victims' families, regardless of race or ethnicity or religion, is not complicated. Thank you. It's called civilian protection. Against this backdrop, we enter our panel confronting global threats, standing up for integrity, holding space for the millions of families worldwide who can't possibly fathom the comfort and security we're sharing right now. And they serve as a stark reminder of who and what we're fighting for. We have an amazing lineup to discuss not only what's at stake, but also what's possible. So without further ado, I want to begin with opening remarks from our esteemed panelists, and I want to thank you all for joining us at the IACC this week. To begin our discussion, we'll start our opening remarks with Mr. Mouhamadou Diagne. Armed with over 25 years of managing teams in the fight against fraud and corruption, from the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, to inside one of the United States' largest financial institutions. Currently, Mouhamadou serves as the Vice President of Integrity at the World Bank. In this role, his office oversees all internal and partner compliance investigations, litigation of sanctions for credible allegations, and working to raise compliance standards among private sector entities. So to kick us off with his 10,000-foot cross-sector, multi-decade view, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Mouhamadou Diagne.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm very pleased to be here with my distinguished panel members, and thank you very much also to Francois, Ruben, and the other speakers. I think they set up very nicely the context of this conversation and this conference as well. And I think really the overall theme of the conference around confronting global threats fits very nicely with, from a World Bank perspective, how we look at the issue of corruption. We don't think that it's just an issue of ethics or values or some aspirational governance. It is truly a developmental hurdle. It is truly an issue of addressing global challenges and threats. When you look at the major threats that we deal with, or the major challenges that we're dealing with as an international development institution, you will find corruption having a very strong nexus to each of those different challenges that we're dealing with. The first one for us being jobs, growth, and poverty reduction. When you look at the issue of growth, corruption is one of the major impediments to growth in the countries. Just think of the issues around, for example, domestic resource mobilization, issues that countries are having mobilizing resources internally because of tax evasion and the like. You think about the failures of social and economic reforms in the countries. As a matter of fact, interestingly, the World Bank did country surveys to try to understand why do economic and social reforms fail in countries. And interestingly, the number one cause of failure was not the traditional areas that people think about, around the technical design or around lack of capacity and the like. The number one cause that was identified was corruption as to why economic and social reforms fail in countries. So it is a major impediment to economic development. When you think about job and the impact of corruption and the deterrence effect it has on attracting foreign investments, because of the high cost of doing business, because of the high risk premium, it is a significant impediment to foreign investment, at least high quality foreign investment. And low investments means low job creation. Low job creation means you can really address the issue of poverty. That is a major impediment as well. You think about another global challenge we're dealing with, which is resilience and crisis preparedness, helping countries be resilient and be prepared for crisis. You only need to look back at the most recent pandemic that we have, the most recent global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the impact of corruption on both how it undermined the preparedness of the countries because of the diversion of critical investments from health infrastructure and social services to other rent-seeking activities. So it really undermined the preparedness of many countries. Once the crisis hit, we know that in many countries, corruption also weakened the responses. And as we speak, as many countries are in the recovery phase, that is a major risk as well that they are facing. You think about a global challenge such as fragility, conflict, and violence. And this is very important for us as a development institution. In about 5 years, by 2030, half of the world's extreme poor will be living in so-called FCV countries, fragile, conflict, and violent states. Half of the world's extreme poor. Well, one of the major drivers of fragility, conflict, or violence has to do with corruption because of the issues it has around lack of access to jobs, lack of access to security and opportunities. It fuels a lot of frustrations, anger, which in turn translates into social unrest. And you can look at many countries that have experienced social unrest. You can tie it back to the issue of corruption. And last but not least, in terms of global crisis, if you think about the existential crisis of our time, which is the climate crisis, I will not take it as far as saying that corruption caused the climate crisis, but I think I can say with confidence that it has fueled that crisis through the exploitation of or the misuse of natural resources, for example, through, for example, illicit permits and licensing, through state capture in some cases that undermine the implementation of environmental regulation and policies and the like. So there's a very strong nexus between corruption and all these issues. So for all these reasons, I think we really need to look at the issue as a major, major problem in terms of addressing all these global challenges that I talked about and more. Now, I don't want to be sounding all doom and gloom. There has been progress made, and we need to acknowledge it, I think. If you look at the recent years, particularly over the past couple of decades, I think there has been some progress in terms of countries adopting norms and standards. We have seen good progress there, particularly since the adoption of the UN Convention. We have seen development in institutions in the countries. I think there have been steps towards more transparency. For example, you'll see the right to information laws being adopted in many countries, more than 100 countries around the world. You look at citizen engagement and awareness. I think there is a lot more of it today than there ever was, and probably that's going to expand in the age of social media. So I think clearly there has been progress. But the bottom line is the progress is not enough. Corruption is still too pervasive, and I think there are still significant challenges that we need to address. I think some of the challenges we need to address, number one, what I would refer to as the enforcement gap. The norms, the frameworks, the regulations, the rules, they are all great, but they are only as good as their implementation. And I think that's sometimes where things fail because of the lack of implementation, because of the lack of enforcement. And you can trace it to, in my view, the number one cause being the lack of political will. So I think as we reflect, we need to think through how do we enhance political will and really create the momentum that will push forward the fight against corruption in many of the countries. That's number one. Second area, I think, rule of law and justice cannot exist if you do not have strong institutions. And in many countries, I think we have to give credit to many of our colleagues who are present in this room, strong anti-corruption institutions that do incredible work in very challenging and difficult environment, and we really ought to commend their effort. But the reality is there are still many countries where either those institutions do not exist, or if they do exist, it's more window dressing and they tend to be paper tigers, meaning basically that they are not empowered to do their job effectively. And the major issues there tend to be around lack of resources, independence issues, and also issues of capability. So I think we need to think through how do we build the capacity to strengthen the accountability institutions. Third area, in my view, that we need to focus on is pushing towards more transparency. I think there's still, corruption tends to thrive in opacity. And there are still many areas where there's too much opacity, whether it's around government spending, whether it's around public procurement, whether it's around contract management, beneficial ownership, disclosure of assets, you name it, in all these areas, I think we need far greater levels of transparency than we have today. And therefore, I think it's really important that we focus on open government reforms in order to create more accountability for government and more inclusiveness. Another area I would also highlight, in my view, is addressing the role of enablers, because this is significant. I think it's President François Valérien who, in his opening remarks, talks about the issue of illicit financial flows, and it is a major issue that we need to address. If you take the case of Africa, for example, illicit financial flows almost entirely offset the inflows of foreign direct assistance and official development assistance. And most of those illicit financial flows are the proceeds of corrupt activities. We need to address this, and a lot of times when we talk about corruption, we focus on corrupt activities in the global south countries, and rightfully so, because those countries are the most impacted by corruption. So I think it's important to focus on those countries, but the reality is we also need to focus on the other side of the equation, which is all these enablers, professional individuals or entities in accounting, in finance, in law, in corporate trust, who enable the evasion of these significant flows from those countries a lot of times into the global north. I think this enabling side of the corruption equation has not been forcefully addressed in the past, and we need to deal with it more squarely. The last piece I would mention is we can focus a lot on technical solutions around institutions, around processes, around rules, regulations, and the like, and these are all very important, but also there is a dimension that we should not underestimate, which is the cultural dimension. Realities differ from place to place, from country to country, but I think there are far too many places around the world where corruption is still taken as just the way things are, or the cost of doing business. That is not acceptable. Those attitudes have to change. And I think while we focus on the technical solutions and on the processes, we need to also address the issue of behavior change. And I think to start reflecting on how do we leverage things like behavioral science to change attitudes is going to be increasingly important. So in conclusion, I think what I try to describe is this is a phenomenon with multiple dimensions. I don't think there is a silver bullet. There is no one size fits all. Each of these aspects I mentioned, it is an important lever, it is an important enabler, but it's not going to work by itself. They all have to work in combination as a system, which means anti-corruption strategies really have to be holistic, they have to be comprehensive, and what it means also, and that will be my final point, is that we need to take a partnership approach and focus on collective action.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diagne. And we're going to save questions for the end so that all of our panelists have the opportunity to give opening remarks. So next up, we're honored to be joined by the Council of Europe Secretary General, Marija Pejčinović Burić. Before her ascension to the helm of the continent's leading body for human rights, democracy, and rule of law, Marija devoted her life to public service, beginning in her home country of Croatia as the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, with many representative roles ranging from the EU to NATO, among many others, and emerged as an anti-corruption advocate long before her current leadership of the 46 member states of the Council of Europe. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Secretary Pejčinović Burić.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the Council of Europe being invited to this event, because we indeed, I will try to explain you how we deal with this scourge of corruption that doesn't discriminate, exists everywhere. And I would take on of what my previous colleague panelist said, we need partnerships. And in that spirit, I'm here. I represent regional organization of 46, encompassing almost the whole continent of Europe. But with some issues we cover globally. And one of them is also the corruption, artificial intelligence, the most lately, cybercrime, and data protection, just to mention a few. So let me begin with saying that the Council of Europe pillars of the work is protection and promotion of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And when listening very carefully to people who have addressed this morning, they all, one way or the other, mentioned these basic values that we need to protect. In the Council of Europe, we have for long understood the corrosive effect that corruption has on all of these. The Council of Europe actually, as different to some others, deals with the public sector. So whatever I say has direct impact on the public sector, but also indirectly also touches other places where corruption may take place. So we have in place standards, monitoring, and technical assistance designed to counter it. We call it a golden triangle, where we set standards, we set immediately through conventions or other legal frameworks. We set also the monitoring bodies to report on it, and technical assistance in need to assist the governments to counter it. But in recent times, a new challenge has emerged, not really new anymore, which we have seen really crippling in Europe and in the wider world, which is very dangerous towards democratic, which is called democratic backsliding. And with extreme populism and nationalism fueling what I would call just anti-right movements. And the aim of all of these is weakening democratic institutions, undermining respect to the rule of law, and all of this, of course, creates perfect conditions in which corruption can spread and thrive. So what is to be done in this, what we are doing? Last year we have the summit, and I would like to remind you we are celebrating 75th anniversary, and this summit was only the 4th one, so it's not a regular feature. And among things which led us to have a summit of 46 leaders gathering in Reykjavik was this backsliding in democracy, because in my reports, which I issue every year, I of course, based on the monitoring body's reports, I record that the backsliding continues from year to year. So as someone said, let's not go from here just giving analysis and diagnosis, but also let's see what we can do. So our leaders in Reykjavik really agreed on numerous measures how to tackle the issues of the issue that pertain to backsliding in democracy, which was emanating through principles of democracy, by which to measure and address the health of European democracy. So this is what we started with. And these principles include a commitment to the relentless fight against corruption, holding to account those in power, fighting, of course, organized crime, and maintaining the separation of powers, ensuring independent, impartial, and effective judiciaries, and encouraging democratic participation through free and fair elections. And I think in the year where we have worldwide the record year of elections all around, I think we all share a bit of fear of what is elections may bring if they are not free, if they are not fair, and if people are not participating in them in the way they should. So independent checks and balances are, of course, essential. The Council of Europe work with its member states to help them deliver on all of these work, but central to that is and will be the work of our monitoring bodies, and I will just name a few that are important to this discussion, and where we have deep expertise in tackling corruption in its evolving forms. So let me first mention Venice Commission, which is one of those forums within the Council of Europe that encompasses much larger number of countries around the world than the 46 member states, which helps governments strengthen the rule of law. So when the rule of law is in danger, Venice Commission is the advisory body to give the recommendation on how to go about it. Second, Monival, which is a younger sister of FATF, which is our European body leading with the fight of money laundering. And of course, the most important group of states against corruption called GRECO, whose remit includes fighting and preventing corruption among judges, prosecutors, and members of the parliament, central government law enforcement, and they are all subject to evaluation rounds. And believe me, when I go to high-level visits, I always mention several things that are important for the country to closer have a look or work with. And GRECO doesn't discriminate. GRECO is not happy. There is no perfect government as such among the 46. And I always witness more or less the same thing. If the countries have a longer list of recommendations, then they try to persuade that they did more than what the monitoring body shows, or where they are few and they are really very good pupils in the house. Then they found it difficult that they are also those who can be called because they haven't done things. And sometimes you mention the differences in cultures. And when you look at how our democratic systems work, yes, indeed, there are long-standing democracies in which some things can function, but for instance, the role of GRECO is to set the rules that should apply to everyone the same way. So when the GRECO comes and say the revolving doors in some very developed countries may be a problem, then I think you would all agree that even when there are not major problems in the countries, but there is a risk, there should be an effort to go around that. This is just to give you an example that it is a continuous work, which is not always the easy one, but it does yield results, just you need sometimes patience and time and coming over back and again to address the issues. We have new areas where Greco will do the evaluation. The next one is the regional level of governance, and of course ensuring that honest and law-abiding governments must not be left to the governments, those governments alone. Even within the support of international organizations as we are, we need others, we need you who are around in this table to serve this watchdog function too. We believe that this is a very important part. And among these are the free media and civil society, both of which investigate, gather information, and hold authorities to account at the national and international level. So this encourages this culture of openness and integrity. But part of the democratic backsliding that we see today is the intentional intimidation of journalists. And we see that in my recording over the last 5 years that I hold this function, I see it more and more present. Is it due increasingly because of the pandemic that we had, and that opened up space for many to backpedal from where we were, or other things, the increasing war in Europe or all around the world? I don't know, but it is an increasingly worrying space, and deliberate use and misuse of laws to shrink civic space, to prevent accountability. For a clear and tragic example of this, and here I also recall one of the speeches of the beginning mentioning the Soviet times. I think Russia nowadays is backpedaling very much to that, or is almost there. So we need only to think of Alexei Navalny, who campaigned against corruption, promoted investigative journalism, and unfortunately paid by his life for his relentless work on that. And that is just a part of Russia's spiral of descent for democratic norms. But we can reverse these trends. And at the Council of Europe, we are providing for new tools to do so. Last April, our Committee of Ministers adopted a recommendation to member states. This is, apart from convention, a soft law way to approach the governments, and one of them is guiding them to devise effective strategies against lapse, against these strategic lawsuits against public participation that we see used increasingly to prevent journalists, civil society actors, and whistleblowers and human rights defenders from being just simply able to do their work. So we have other range of tools to help governments create a space for healthy civic organization and engagement. And in very recent reforms within the Council, we devised a new roadmap to enable closer civil society engagement with our own policy processes. Lastly, I want to mention again something that was tackled by my previous panelists and by someone in the opening plenary, a specific form of corruption that we must take further steps to address, which is environmental corruption that causes terrible and wide-ranging harms, from the impact of bypassing important regulations to the direct release of toxic substances into our air, our water, or earth. And our Reykjavik Declaration issued at the summit that I mentioned was clear about the threat to our rights posed by the triple planetary crisis caused by pollution, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. So we cannot allow corrupt and illegal practices to make this worse, and we must instead act together to prevent such offenses. Greco has been very clear about the need for governments to play their part in this, as they must all anti-corruption efforts. And we are at work at this stage on a new convention on the protection of environment through criminal law, because we think we need also to raise awareness, but also have tools to address these issues. And we hope this should be, the work on this convention should be finished by the end of the year, and of course we hope that many countries will join and ratify and bring it into force. So to end this part, I would say something you all very well know. This is a never finished job. We can never take for granted what we acquired, because it can always go backwards, unfortunately. And it certainly requires a determined and concerted effort. But where there is a political will, and I think on political will many already were mentioning this very important aspect, we certainly can both shape and apply the tools that prevent and protect against it to the greatest possible extent. With the 46 governments with the Reykjavik Declaration, were clearly stating this determination. And I agree also some progress has been made. Our work has to move forward. And of course, as I say, we have to work equally on prevention so that it doesn't happen, but when it happens, on prosecution, and for that we need institutions that are in place and that are actually slowly but surely changing the culture of being more open government, more open space for others to engage, protecting us from this scourge of corruption. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Secretary General. And now we're switching gears. I'd like to introduce Richard Nephew. He's the U.S. State Department's coordinator on global anti-corruption. Richard returned to the department from Columbia University, where he was a senior research scholar focusing on sanctions, deterrence, and nuclear proliferation. This work was based on his previous years of government service in a range of roles, including Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, Director for Iran on the National Security Staff, and other roles and offices dedicated to nonproliferation. For a sense of USG's position on our issues and role in our fight, please welcome Mr. Richard Nephew.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks also to TI and especially the IACC committee, not only for inviting me to speak here today, but also for convening this august community here in Vilnius for a remarkable week of events. And congratulations as well, and thanks to Lithuania for its hosting. We know how exhausting a hosting event can be. Those of us in governments often talk about civil society's importance to the anti-corruption fight. But events like this, sharing the stage with my esteemed co-panelists and all of the impressive and inspiring people who have been and will be up here throughout the week, really underscores just how incredible this community is and how invaluable it is to lift one another's voices. I'm just 2 weeks shy of my 2-year anniversary as the State Department's coordinator. See if I do it again. I think my team has made important contributions so far, but there is much more to do. For example, we're developing new approaches to guide how the department identifies and responds to specific corruption challenges, as well as the tools that we can use to do so. For example, one thing that we've decided to prioritize is the threat presented by strategic corruption. Put baldly, there are some countries that see corruption not as a problem, but rather as an opportunity. Fortunately, many of the same tools that we use to address corruption more generally are the best to deal with this threat. Still, we must call out these threats as we see them and conceptualize our responses accordingly. I expect you'll hear more about this issue and others as we begin to operationalize some of our ideas. In addition to my 2-year anniversary in this position, we've also reached the 2.5-year anniversary of the launch of the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption. That strategy has supercharged our work on countering corruption, creating new internal and external coordination mechanisms, giving the U.S. government ambitious policy priorities, and organizing our work in exciting new ways. The strategy also compelled us to look carefully at how we do our work, and one result has been our recommitment to transparency in our anti-corruption work. For example, the State Department published a public implementation plan for how we're putting the strategy into action. We've launched a website to consolidate our peer reviews by external anti-corruption bodies, and we've committed to providing public updates on how we're doing in our strategy implementation. We're also planning now for how we will implement the Combating Global Corruption Act that, among other things, will have us publish annual reports on corruption around the world. I've stood up other offices in the department before, but I have to say this job has been uniquely affecting. I've seen the haunting direct and personal effects that rampant corruption has around the world, the opportunities it denies hardworking people, the taxpayers it robs of their well-deserved public services, and the deleterious effects it has on any number of other issues, from national security to advancing an equity agenda. And I've had the privilege to meet inspiring anti-corruption champions who advocate fearlessly and slog away at complex and tedious work of technical reforms and investigations to bring about a more just and transparent future around the world. One of the things I found most interesting about this job is that it is, on its face, fairly uncontroversial. I've yet to meet someone who is overtly pro-corruption. But it is at the same time an inherently controversial topic, one that people rarely want to admit to having firsthand experience with, and one tied to foundational legitimacy of government. There's almost nothing truly black and white, and we see in the corruption landscape all sorts of predicate crimes and enabling behaviors that allow corruption to flourish. In my 2 years in this role, I've watched a growing recognition that it is only by considering the full networks that allow corrupt actors to engage in and benefit from their misdeeds that we can address the root causes of corruption and cut off its spread. One of the new commitments that we made under the strategy is to analyze and consider enablers and drivers of corrupt behavior. We've gone beyond the commitment to merely consider enablers and have continued onward to supporting action. So, for instance, we have adopted a presidential proclamation to restrict visas for those who enable corruption. We've adopted policies and regulations to address loopholes and vulnerabilities in our financial system. The administration has called on Congress to enact legislation that would give the executive branch more authorities to continue to address these challenges at home, and we've convened discussions among experts to elevate the profile of this issue. We're similarly focused on how to approach accountability for those who engage in corruption. Our primary objective is to promote local accountability, including by bolstering the systems and capacities that allow the identification, exposure, and prosecution of corruption where it happens. But we recognize that is not always feasible. And when that is the case, we actively pursue use of U.S. tools to promote accountability, such as the imposition of sanctions or visa restrictions, to maximize impact, advance systemic change, and address corruption in all its forms. These designations can disrupt corrupt networks and activity while demonstrating that corrupt actors may not operate with impunity. But perhaps more importantly, they signal to members of the public and to beleaguered anti-corruption champions that the United States is a partner. We're also vigorously enforcing our anti-corruption laws, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and we are actively working through implementation of the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which provides U.S. prosecutors with an additional tool aimed at the demand side of bribery. Central to both of these issues of enablers and accountability is the basic fact that none of us can do this work alone. We have a symbiotic relationship across sectors, wherein governments and international organizations set the international norms and rules of the road, and civil society and journalists hold governments to account, wherein non-governmental actors drive research and analysis of effective practices and emerging trends, which then informs how governments and international organizations develop consensus and responses. So it will not shock anyone in this room that we work better when we work together. And that goes for how we approach resourcing as well. We should and do combine resources to maximize our impact, whether it's donors coordinating to ensure complementarity among programs, experts across countries and sectors exchanging experiences and lessons learned to make implementing technical reforms a bit easier, or coordinating on our accountability actions to ensure that we cut off all pathways by which corrupt actors and proceeds of corruption may scatter. Similarly, this cross-pollination and collaboration is central to how the United States is thinking about our work across major anti-corruption conferences and multilateral fora. We're working with partners to carry forward common themes from one platform to another, so gains and good practices are not isolated, but rather increasingly reinforce each other. We recognize that discrete anti-corruption issues do not operate in isolation, so we must nurture these conversations across bodies, bringing together different types of experts and actors. To that point, it's great to see that so many officials and international organizations are here at this year's IACC, building upon that of the previous IACC that we hosted in DC, and the many other events in between. I hope we can continue this practice of cross-sectoral conversations to have a steady stream of specific conversations from the COSP to GASIF, from IACC to OGP. So I'd like to bring us back to the prompt for this session, which asks if anyone is listening. And I'd like to assure everyone in this room, at least on behalf of the US government, that not only are we listening, we are learning from you and hoping to work with you as partners. And on that note, I look forward to this discussion and to those throughout this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nephew. Now, joining us on behalf of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, it is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Tatiana Molcean, the Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. A career diplomat, Tatiana brings 20 years of experience in the public sector with extensive international cooperation and development experience, including as the permanent representative of Moldova to the UN Office, World Trade Organization, and other international organizations in Geneva, as well as her in-depth knowledge and expertise across the entire UN ECE membership. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Ms. Tatiana Molcean.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to underline the deep honor that I have to represent the UN Secretary General to this conference and to give the perspective, an international perspective, to these discussions rather than one limited to the region that I represent. And I would like to start by also expressing gratitude to our host, to Lithuania, for bringing us to this beautiful city of Vilnius, and to the organizers for having this meeting at this important time. And I'm not referring only to the season, you know, June versus November or December it was, but because it's really an important time in addressing the challenges in the fight against corruption, but also it's a time of opportunities. And one of the first opportunities that comes to my mind is the wide diversity of participants at this conference. It's very pleasing to see that we have both government leaders, private sector representatives, civil society, academia, and international organizations and regional organizations. And I would like to commend in particular the Council for bringing us, I understand it's the first time when you have a more diversified voice, including a strong focus on journalists and young participants. So this is very important. This is an opportunity that we have to harness at these discussions these days while we are here. But before I talk more about opportunities that we have at international level, let me reflect on a few challenges, global challenges. And one was already reflected by my colleague from the Council of Europe. This is the rule of law. And the situation we now face, all of us, it's eroding. We have, all over the world, we have seen when example of agreements being really ignored, not only breached, but ignored completely. Human rights backsliding. This has been already a situation that we have seen for several years. Institutions, some of the institutions are really questions about their existence. And of course, when we have these challenges to the rule of law, when rule of law erodes, then it's also corruption rises and to the surface. And it really thrives on this cacophony, if I may say, of chaos and division. So this is why this is one of the biggest challenges, and it's a challenge for our global family. And we as a global community, as a family, let me remind you, we all agreed on an agenda for our development, Agenda 2030. We all agreed how we want to see our future, yes, by 2030. We have clear goals, sustainable development goals, and it's devastating to see how corruption affects the accomplishment of these goals. Of course, the first one that comes to mind, and bearing in mind the participants we mostly have here, it's the SDG 16, which is on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So it goes without saying that corruption undermines the accomplishment of this sustainable development goal. And I mean, when we have justice is distorted, of course, corruption thrives, and we have impunity all over the world. But what is very important, that actually corruption affects all the other SDGs. So it's not only 16 where we address, justice sector. And the first one that comes to mind is, of course, that corruption feeds poverty and social injustice and imbalances, inequalities, including gender inequalities. So this is a proven, I don't think I have to talk very much in detail what is the impact of corruption on this particular sector. It also fuels the conditions that lead to conflict, so to security. And I think this goes, again, without saying how important to address this kind of challenges. Speaking about SDGs, and we have the health sector, yes, another important development goal. Again, we know the impact of having billions of dollars that are used not for addressing the challenges for the populations, for equitable vaccine distribution or infiltration of falsified medicines, how impactful that is. And public procurement, again, a big sector that needs to be addressed when it comes to fighting corruption in this sector. I've learned that many of the side events already, and in many of the speakers before that, have mentioned environment. Corruption in the environment sector really enables exploitation of our resources for private gain. And I believe we have some instruments already to address this, but I will talk about this later on. But it addresses both pollution, biodiversity loss, and also when it comes to the oversight mechanisms and safeguards. And since these days, I think everyone talks a lot about sports. We are having a championship in this region, but football championship, but we are coming closer to the Olympics. Yes, so sports again is one sector where we see quite an impact for corruption practices, and it creates really far-reaching consequences, and it's also a sector where we see this empowerment of the criminal groups to profit from this really multi-billion-dollar sports industry, because it's a huge industry. But of course, this relationship between organized crimes and corruption is not limited to the sports sectors. It evolves organized crime and proliferates globally in all countries. And through these parallel structures that are being created, it provokes corruption. And we can give many examples. I'm certain that many of you know more and in detail how, if it's weapons deport where firearms are diverted into criminal hands, a border checkpoint, or port with illicit goods are allowed through. All of this really is possible due to some corruption implications. And of course, criminal groups rely heavily on complex networks, facilitators ranging from lawyers to accountants to bankers and more. What is very important, organized crime counts on illicit financial networks for money laundering and related financial crimes, really benefiting from the gaps in the jurisdiction as well as corrupt actors to move funds between the illicit and illicit economies. Now, what we have, the end result is that we have really a world where organized crime can find pockets to operate, where people lose faith in the future, where violence proliferates and development really slips from our reach. And this is why it's important, and when I was saying that it's important that we step up global anti-corruption efforts, regional and national anti-corruption efforts. And in this sense, I would like to turn to the opportunities, and by emphasizing the need for a holistic approach. We need to work together, but also having a common understanding on some of the facts. So we have to have a comprehensive approach, preventive measures, criminalization of all forms of corruption, robust criminal justice response, effective international cooperation, and the recovery of stolen assets. I think this is very important. And we have already a very strong, comprehensive and near-universal framework for anti-corruption, and one of my colleagues already, fellow panelists already mentioned, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which is quasi-universal because we have 190 parties today, and for 20 years it provides really countries with a common platform to address all forms of corruption. Of course, the convention has already brought a lot of benefits. It has served as a basis for transformative legal and institutional reforms in many countries. But what I would like to underline that there is still a huge potential to improve cooperation based on this framework, because it can serve really as a rallying point for all stakeholders on anti-corruption and to help bridge those gaps that I was referring in the beginning. And once again, I mean, we need to build the capacities in the countries to address these challenges, and it can be done both through international cooperation, regional cooperation, and national level. But of course, to do this, we need a strong, resolute political will at the highest level of leadership. We need also strong investments of financial resources in training, in capacity building, and the exchange of best practices, which we already have seen here happening, using also the implementation review mechanism of the convention to guide us on the needs and areas of improvement. We need also to leverage now new technologies and digitalization for accountability and transparency. But there are many challenges in that sector as well, as we have heard, so this is why we really need a stronger data gathering framework, analysis, and measurement of the corruption. We also, as I was hinting from the beginning, we need stronger partnerships with all stakeholders to fulfill, every stakeholder to fulfill their critical role in the fight against corruption. I welcome the participation of the private sector, and I think in this area, the one on digital and AI, I think the tech companies have really a growing responsibility to ensure that their tools are used to fight rather than enable corruption. Civil society, again, the importance, academia, and last but not least, we have to elevate the voices of the people and communities that are mostly affected by corruption, including young people, who have the greatest stake, because they are the ones who have to live in the future that we all create. And United Nations really remains committed to bringing governments and all stakeholders together to fight against corruption, a goal that really transcends national boundaries and interests and affects all of us. And at this critical time for the world and its people, I urge all of you to see and use the universal platform that the UN is building to promote trust, rule of law, and stand for integrity, transparency, and accountability. And I think one of the key elements that in the few months member states of the United Nations will be convened at the Summit of the Future, where we'll have a pact for the future. And it's important that the fight against corruption will continue to be a key element in these discussions about our future, and it underpins our efforts to overcome the global challenges of today. And now it's really an important moment for anti-corruption and the words action and solutions that are offered by every partner, in particular those that we will have throughout these days at this conference, are being reflected in those discussions in New York in a couple of months. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Molcean. It's now my pleasure to introduce Sanjay Pradhan of Open Government Partnerships. As the CEO of OGP, he leads a network of 76 countries and more than 100 local governments, together representing more than 2 billion people, along with thousands of civil society organizations working together to make governments more transparent, participatory, and responsive to citizens, and of course, less corrupt. Sanjay's long advanced this mission beyond the OGP, including previously at the World Bank, and has more than earned his title as the Schwab Foundation's 2022 Social Innovator of the Year for being, quote, a tireless champion of good governance and fighting corruption. Please give a round of applause for our next speaker, Sanjay Pradhan.
Thank you, Anna. Dear panelists, Anna, with your permission, I'd like to simply stand up so I can better see and speak with our wonderful audience here at IICC who seem so distant. So dear esteemed panelists, dear friends, corruption has fueled and exacerbated the unprecedented threats to democracy we confront today. The internal threats are coming from plummeting citizen trust in governments perceived to be corrupt, and populist leaders have exploited this citizen distrust to get elected and then attack democratic institutions. The external threats are coming from kleptocratic autocrats like Putin, enriching themselves with impunity and undermining democracy across borders. To tackle these threats, let me suggest two collective priorities for us here at IICC. And let me illustrate these with concrete examples from over 1,000 anti-corruption reforms advanced by government and civil society across our 75-country partnership over the last 13 years, of which half of the reforms have been independently assessed to have delivered real progress in tackling corruption. So our first collective priority is to build on this progress and scale up ambitious reforms that make openness a new global norm, that advance new global norms for openness so that the corrupt exceptions have nowhere left to hide. And let me suggest 3 global norms on openness that we can advance and achieve if we combine our collective efforts. So are you ready for this? The first global norm, end anonymous companies. This is not a pipe dream. Today, 40 OGP countries, from Armenia to the UK, are advancing beneficial ownership transparency. Last year, Nigeria became the first African country to launch its public beneficial ownership register, which Nigerian civil society have called the most significant law in decades that can stop the illicit flow of $15 billion. Second global norm. Make all procurement contracts open, as many of our esteemed colleagues have said. Today, 70 OGP governments have committed to open contracting. Last year, the UNCAC resolution, the first ever on procurement, provided vital impetus to accelerate progress. Now, the interesting thing is, open contracting combined with open company ownership can together deliver powerful results. Slovakia has legislated that no company can win a procurement contract if its ownership is anonymous. In 2015, Ukraine launched the world's first beneficial ownership register. and its award-winning open contracting platform, Prozoro, saved $6 billion in 6 years, and 80% of businesses surveyed reported reduced corruption from the platform Prozoro. Today, interestingly, Ukraine is integrating open contracting and beneficial ownership transparency with a new platform called DREAM to ensure accountability in post-war reconstruction. Third global norm. Make lobbying and political party financing transparent. Today, 22 OGP members have committed to lobbying transparency. Just this morning, we heard from Ingrida the inspirational lobbying transparency right here of Lithuania. In Ireland, to curb influence peddling that contributed to the financial crisis, the government implemented a public register that discloses meetings and gifts between lobbyists and public officials. In Croatia, the State Election Commission disclosed incomes of political parties, which civil society are monitoring. You know, with upcoming elections in over 60 countries, we must tackle disinformation and the harmful impacts of AI that corrode electoral integrity. Canada today is fighting disinformation by strengthening the transparency of online political campaigns. So, my call to action: scale up ambitious reforms like this by taking up our Open Gov Challenge, for which you can find information on our website, and nominate such ambitious reforms that create new norms of openness across 10 areas that we list on our website, including anti-corruption, digital governance, and protection of civic space and media freedoms. Our second collective priority must be to forge bigger and broader and stronger coalitions with reformers and activists inside and outside government to advance these ambitious reforms. We have compelling evidence from 13 years in OGP that when government reformers partner with civil society, when they co-create reforms together, the reforms are more ambitious and the results are stronger. In Armenia, it was the combined efforts of government reformers publishing the beneficial ownership register, which civil society and media then analyzed, which together helped highlight the risks of Russia's growing influence in the country's mining sector. But to reap such dividends, we must together enhance and increase the spaces for government and civil society to work together in multi-stakeholder platforms like OGP, EITI, and others. And I call on us to protect courageous journalists and anti-corruption activists who we know, as the Secretary General also just mentioned now, has come under relentless attacks. Through OGP, the Dominican Republic is one of the first countries globally to develop an ambitious national strategy to strengthen civic space. We must also mobilize champions inside government to advance through a whole-of-government approach. Colombia and Finland are mobilizing ministries across governments through an open government strategy. Spain is working at all levels of government to create an open state agenda, working with ministries, regions, and municipalities. So in closing, at this IACC, and I've probably attended almost all of them, let us go beyond platitudes about how harmful corruption is. This is, after all, our 11th IACC, or whichever the number is. Let's go beyond platitudes of how harmful corruption is. We know it is, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But instead, let us translate communiques and commitments and speeches made here at IACC into concrete actions, including through OGP action plans, so they don't just remain sound bites and tweets. And let us forge broader and stronger coalitions to advance such ambitious reforms that make openness, not corruption, the global norm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Next up, we're joined by UNDP's Francine Pickup. Francine brings decades of development experience to her current role, and our panel from across the globe, from Serbia, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, to Central Asia, and even New York with the United Nations, and within other invaluable partner organizations, including Amnesty International, Oxfam, and the World Bank. Currently, she serves as Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Director at UNDP's Bureau of Policy and Program Support. Please give a warm welcome to our next panelist on behalf of our friends at UNDP, Francine Pickup.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you all in Vilnius today. And it's just 18 months since the last IAC conference in Washington, and what a lot has changed in those last 18 months. We're seeing increased crisis, whether we talk about climate, whether we talk about conflict, democratic and gender backsliding on rights, geopolitical tensions, and the list goes on. And in this riskier world, we're also seeing rising gap between rich and poor countries, rising inequality. UNDP came out with its latest Human Development Report not so long ago, which showed that after 20 years of convergence, we're now seeing that the gap between rich and poor and inequality is increasing. And it's that rising inequality that also breeds that sense of insecurity that tears apart the fabric of societies. So that Human Development Report, which is called Breaking the Gridlock, shows that 1 in 2 people feel that they're not in control of their lives. And 2 out of 3 people don't feel that their voices are being heard in their political systems. So it's this sense of powerlessness that often translates into resentment, mistrust, and populism that people have talked about today. And at the same time, we are seeing that development financing is also in crisis. The global financial architecture is struggling to respond to these multiple crises that we're facing. And this really limits the ability of international organizations and governments to respond to people's longer-term needs rather than be reactionary and short-term. Another analysis that we did in UNDP showed that there are 52 countries, low or middle-income countries, that are currently either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, and that reduced ODA affects 2.9 billion people in 70 developing countries. So combating corruption and illicit financial flows is really important if we are to attract the sustainable development financing that's needed to address these kinds of crises that we're facing today. A lot of the panelists have talked about the triple planetary crisis, so around climate, biodiversity loss, and pollution, which is posing an existential threat to us all. From illegal logging and wildlife trafficking to bribery in environmental permits to lax environmental regulation enforcement to corruption in climate finance, corruption inflicts severe damage on our already fragile ecosystems, and it impacts the poor and most vulnerable, including women, the most. And although it's difficult to measure accurately, Transparency International, many of you will have come across this stat already, has estimated that anywhere between 1.4 and 35% of all climate funds have been lost to corruption. And in only 1 year, over 350 land and environment defenders have lost their lives, were murdered. So, as my colleague from the World Bank said at the beginning, corruption in its many forms and manifestations is worsening the climate crisis, pollution and biodiversity loss, and hindering progress towards the SDGs. So given this rather bleak picture, how can we invest in partnerships, collective action, and interconnectedness? And I want to just mention 3 points briefly. Firstly, it's really important that we, in response to the scale of the challenges that we face, respond with a new scale and ambition. When it comes to climate, as UNDP, we work on a climate promise, which is working with more than 120 countries on their nationally determined contributions, their climate ambition. That covers over 80% of developing countries. And we're helping those countries to raise their ambition, to develop the plans, and attract the financing to implement that ambition. Now, governance is critical to achieving that climate ambition, and anti-corruption is critical to achieving that ambition. Second, as highlighted in the Human Development Report, we need a new generation of public goods powered by digitization to help bring us together and support accountability and integrity. So, for example, UNDP here is supporting the adoption of an inclusive digital public infrastructure as a fundamental layer which enables other digital innovations to flourish, which help address that digital divide, including the gender digital divide. So, for example, we work with over 50 countries on the implementation of DPI and co-lead the DPI Safeguards Initiative with the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology to help ensure that digital transformation is supporting inclusion, accountability, integrity, and the protection of human rights. And then thirdly, we need to see that anti-corruption measures are a development financing issue. Corruption, the illicit financial flows, money laundering, embezzlement, and financial secrecy all contribute to a severe strain on development financing, and they drive mistrust, inequality, and the abuse of power. And so here, when organizations like us work on helping countries develop their, what we call integrated national financing frameworks, basically helping them plan their finances, both domestic and international sources of finance, to align those with the SDGs. We do that in over 85 countries. We have to make sure that governance and anti-corruption is fundamental to that work. And then finally, I would just draw attention, like my colleague from the UN, to the opportunity that we have in the year ahead. It's a really busy year in terms of international events. We have upcoming the Summit of the Future, followed next year by the Conference on Financing for Development, 10 years since the Addis Ababa Declaration. And then we have those 3 environment COPs towards the end of this year on climate, on land degradation, and on biodiversity loss. And these must be used as opportunities to really reinvigorate multilateralism and make sure that anti-corruption is at the heart of the development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francine. And before we introduce our final panelist, if people have questions, start thinking about them now, because we will be taking audience questions following the last remarks. So, last but not least, I am so delighted to introduce a longtime champion of all of our issues and a friend of Transparency International, Anita Ramasastry. Anita is the Henry M. Jackson Professor of Law and the Director of the Sustainable International Development Graduate Program at the University of Washington School of Law. She's a leading expert in the fields of anti-corruption, commercial law, sustainable development, and a pioneer in the field of business and human rights, currently serving as a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, on which she previously served as its chair. Ramasastry's leadership and service spans from the World Economic Forum to Transparency International to Global Witness, as many other governmental and international organizations. In 2021, Anita was also appointed as the Special Representative on Combating Corruption at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to the inimitable Anita Ramasastry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank all of you and to our host for this. The academic is the last one, and you can ignore everything I say because we're just too theoretical. But I want to reflect, and actually this picture, Ruben said 2008 was his first IACC, and Ruben, it was my first, right? And oh, how young and enthusiastic it was now. And I'm like Ruben, my knees hurt, I'm older, I've got to be careful I don't trip down the stairs. And that picture is actually from like 2008, so I think I better update it, right? A lot more gray in my hair. But I want to say that as a professor who teaches a program in sustainable international development, and I'm of course pleased when I come to these conferences that my students are now, here, right, working in the field, and it's wonderful. But think about the world we're in, and you've heard about this from all of our distinguished panelists. I wake up every morning and I don't want to read the news, and I think about novels that I read, and I like sort of dystopian fiction, and I watch movies with science fiction, and I think, I could never have written any of these scripts, right? As creative as we all think, it's like, could you write the novel we're living in now? It's really kind of one that is unfolding and very surprising and maybe scary. And I say that because to some extent, while we're all up here saying we know the solutions, and Sanjay, I think your solutions are pretty persuasive, I think the larger issue is, as a professor, I get up and I say to my students, I actually don't know, right? I thought I knew, right? I thought I knew everything. I thought with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we'd have a world of peace, security, and prosperity. But now I don't know. And so I think part of why we have these conferences is actually not to say we know what the solutions are, but quite the opposite, that we don't know. And so it is this collective wisdom, networking, and discussion that helps us think about innovation. And that welcomes in the next generation, right? It really is sort of younger people who have to kind of innovate and tell us what we're doing wrong and where we need to go. So just wearing my professor hat, just want to say that, right? Is that sometimes when I teach these days, I have to stop and say, those theories really don't work anymore. So that's the first thing. But now why I was invited here is I do wear, so my day hat as a professor, but I really have had the privilege over the past 4 years of being what's called the special representative. I don't know what's special about it, but the special representative to the chair of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on combating corruption. So I report to, and the chair is a different country or state each year. This year it's Malta. But the OSCE has, I think, a special role in this space. We've heard a lot about development. We've heard about a variety of things from the World Bank, from UNDP, from the Council of Europe, around kind of how to deal with corruption. And the one issue we haven't talked as much about is corruption in relation to security and peace building. And so the OSCE, which was, again, has its roots back in the Helsinki Act in the 1990s, is the largest regional security organization with 57 participating states. So 57 different countries are involved. And dealing with security, right? Security in the sort of post-Soviet region. And so the work that I do as special representative is to work with many of the states. Actually, Sanjay, you had lots of great examples from the region. I work with those states, I work with civil society and others around corruption and preventing corruption as a means of preserving security and conflict prevention. And I think, again, as we think about the world we're in, and you can think about your own regions, it really is critical. So right now, as I think about sort of the fragility in places like the Western Balkans, we, of course, have heard about the Russian war and aggression in Ukraine. There are many areas that are very fragile. So corruption prevention is just essential as a matter of conflict prevention and security. And the OSCE thinks about it not just as military, right? It's not just about thinking about sort of preventing corruption in the defense sector or war, but as a cross-dimensional issue. So there are 3 dimensions of work at the OSCE. The human dimension, so actually thinking about human rights, the economic and environmental dimension, where I do a lot of my work, and then, of course, the military and political dimension as well. So when I say security, it's about really resilient and sustainable societies as a way of preventing conflict. And so I work on many of the issues that have already been discussed. Transparency, so OSCE cooperates very actively with the Open Government Partnership. We work on asset recovery, we work on transparency, and we work on engagement with civil society. And I'm not going to go into all of the different things that the OSCE does, but just to say for many of you who may not be aware of its work, I think it's another important organization that has intergovernmental activity. And so the area I just want to speak about for a minute are two. One is migration. So we haven't really talked that much about that. But as we think about both climate, but unfortunately conflict, we have some of the largest human migration and displacement that we've ever seen. Right? It is really record-breaking. And with that, of course, corruption in the movement of people, the trafficking of people, has significant consequences. And so this is just another area that we have to talk about, right, which is this issue of migration. The second one, which has also been mentioned, is climate and the green transition. And I just want to say that at a very practical level, we have to address this. So when I deal with civil society in my role with the OSCE, the thing that percolates up from all of the civil society groups and journalists that I talk to is climate, but really to say why. It's the same thing we saw during the pandemic, which is that when we are in a rush to move ahead to both obtain critical minerals, to grant licenses to companies that were formed yesterday, sometimes owned by politicians in the renewable energy space, when we need to kick indigenous communities off their land, corruption is really at the bottom of so many of these things. So when we move fast, we move quick, we move with procurement, and there's lots of money at stake, it's the typical recipe for corruption. And civil society is already telling us that it's almost too late. So in addition to the sort of planetary crisis, right, corruption is just sort of making it, we're not delivering because we're not actually putting the resources where they need to go. So it is a crisis, and it's one that, again, the OSCE, because it has experts dealing with environmental governance and with civil society and with corruption, I'm able to work and actually say to states, here are the concrete steps you need to take in this space. And I'll just conclude in saying the other things we haven't talked about as much yet, but of course we will, is the private sector. Right? So the larger piece for me, as someone who deals with combating corruption, but also deals with the connection between the private sector and significant human rights abuses, is that we really need the private sector to be part of the solution. They are part of the problem in certain circumstances, not all companies, but they need to be part of the solution, especially with democratic blacksliding. So I'll just conclude. So I went from saying, I don't know the answers. I hope you learned a little bit about the important role, I think, of the OSCE, particularly in the post-Soviet region. And then the last thing I'll say is just really about human rights and why it matters, and why, as you're going to hear from other experts about defending the defenders, really the significant cost right now of corruption. Modern slavery is on the rise. There is a significant increase, and the United Nations and other organizations have reported on this. Both forced labor in supply chains and child labor is on the increase, right? We should not be there. So, and corruption the UN has connected corruption to this increase. So again, if we think about the significant cost to human dignity of corruption, we need to address this, and the private sector in particular needs to really address this. And the second area is, again, back to climate, which is the human rights consequences of corruption in the green energy sector are significant. Indigenous communities are losing their land, are losing their cultural rights, and are often being dispossessed of their property as a result of corruption in the climate space. Human rights defenders and corruption defenders, so land and environmental defenders, are under such attack, and again, similar to modern slavery, the numbers just continue to increase. So I would say these are two areas which really illustrate not only that there is economic loss, but just that there is significant and severe loss of life and dignity because of these areas, supply chains, global markets, and the rush to a green transition. So again, it's a privilege to be here. I look forward to meeting many of you who are working in these same spaces and really who have a lot to teach. Again, for the younger people, especially in the room, tell us what we're doing wrong, help us get this right, because again, I was here in 2008, I'm here in 2024, and a lot of the same things were said then that are being said today. So I want to hear something new. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita, and to all of our panelists for your insights here and, of course, your service and leadership well beyond. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and maybe we'll have 3 people say your questions at the same time, and then whoever would like to answer any of those, because we have about 10 minutes left. So right here in the front. Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
I forgot the gentleman from the U.S. State Department's name. But when the governor of Florida took the words climate change out of all official documents for Florida, would you consider that corruption?
All right, we'll add another question onto that, and then we'll keep going. Also in the front there.
Hi, I'm Ling from the London School of Economics. So in our discussions, there's been a lot of mention of democratic backsliding, which kind of implies that it is happening in countries that have some levels of democracy. So I wanted to ask if you have any advice on how we can further strengthen anti-corruption measures in closed autocracies or dictatorships, where it's a lot more restrictive for civil society or other actors to take part in. Thank you.
The gentleman in the second row there.
In the second.
Thank you. Pablo, I'm from Mexico, Civil Society, DLM. The question is to Professor Anita. Thank you for being the one who bringing young people to the table. And the question would be, how do we involve, first of all, young people in the conversation on bringing awareness on corruption topics on a daily basis? And second of all, we talk about the importance on tackling corruption in climate field, but I think that we also sometimes leave behind, for example, indigenous people on the conversation. So we talk about these view on standards of human rights protection, but we have not come to understand that their perspective and their actually daily struggle regarding displacement, regarding organized crime, regarding losing their traditional culture. So it would be, how can we bring them up to the table? How can we give them more of a voice and participation, and also for us, young people and young change makers? Thank you.
And let's add in the third row in the center his question, and then we'll let you guys answer as you like. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Professor Mohammed Ladan from Nigeria. I listened actually from the representative of the World Bank to UNDP. I am not convinced that the nexus between climate change impact and corruption has been significantly established. I really need to understand the extent to which this nexus is significantly established, because if you take the issue of climate financing, COP26 in Glasgow collapsed because developed economies promise to provide for climate financing, to assist developing economics in Africa, Latin America, and Asia Pacific, but they failed to do so. We went to actually, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, COP27. We have to find a way of renewing the pledge. So I do not know how the speakers, aim at establishing the nexus between corruption and climate financing. When developing economies have not yet received even the financing, how can corruption creep into the system? When developed economies fail to actually honor their promises in terms of providing the basis for climate financing, who is promoting corruption in this context? Who?
Okay, now to our panelists, anyone who would jump in on any of our 4, 5 questions?
Well, I'm certainly happy to answer the first one. I mean, look, I think the simple reality is not every bad idea is corruption, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't corruption, though, that's implicit in some bad ideas. And I would just sort of say that I think one important point that you highlight is the non-financial concept for quid pro quo that I think is an accepted part of the corruption landscape. I think certainly as a general matter, even if there is not a direct financial outcome, there certainly could be corruption that is involved in something that involves some degree of political favoritism or similar. And I think this is one of the elements that when I said that we're creatively looking into the implementation of our strategies and our anti-corruption work to try and identify the best solutions to address the totality of corrupt activities, whether or not a specific financial piece is part of a transaction.
Thank you. Tatiana?
Yes, since there were a few comments and remarks about corruption or anti-corruption and the climate or environment sector, I would like to refer particularly to this subject, and in a certain way to contradict what Anita says. You mentioned we need solutions, we don't know what solutions. I actually strongly believe that we all know and we all have the solutions. We are not implementing. The political leadership is not delivering. The government is not delivering and implementing. This is the problem. And one sector where we have this kind of solutions, a global universal instrument, is also environment. And I will give you one example from my own organization, so not only from the UN global perspective, but at UNICEF. There is a convention which is called the Aarhus Convention. I don't know how many of you have heard about this. It's about the access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. So this is the Aarhus, access to justice. And usually these are ministries of environment we talk to, but this is all about rule of law and access to justice. It has a complaint mechanism, it has provided a lot of support to the justice systems in the countries, and it even has a special rapporteur for defending the environmental defenders, let's put it like this. So we have this tool, and it has provided a lot of impact to the countries that apply these conventions. How many are doing this? Not many. So we do have the instruments, just we have to apply them. We need courage for this to apply. Because you were asking which are the elements of corruption or financing when there was no financing for climate. Every area, from carbon trading for emissions, for licenses, for the use of natural resources, you have all elements there, but you also have the tools to address these challenges. Just use them.
Yeah. Anita?
Yep. So I don't disagree. I think we have lots of solutions that need to be implemented. I think where we have to be creative, though, is that civil society is often tied in a bind, right? That they have to deal with lack of political will or have to deal with a private sector that's very difficult to challenge. So I just meant more that sort of as we think of bottom up, how do we get creative to force implementation, right? And I would agree, too, with in the OSCE region, we have many Aarhus centers, which are a great way to empower civil society on environmental governance. So I think about all of those things, but to just respond to the questions from the gentleman from Mexico, I think on indigenous communities, what we're seeing here is that another area that is related to anti-corruption is this growing field of business and human rights and responsible business conduct. And in that field, which is becoming similar to anti-corruption, regulatory, where companies are now having to have responsibilities to respect human rights, we're seeing, I think, for the first time, this opening of the door to think about rights and requirements of companies to have to engage in consultation and to engage in free, prior, and informed consent requirements with respect to indigenous communities. Now, there is an issue of capacity building and sort of recognition of those rights, but we're sort of at that cusp. So just to say that I think that the business and human rights and the anti-corruption agendas need to be intertwined as we think about a lot of these areas like climate or renewable energy where rights are being harmed and people are being harmed. And then the question about climate, when resources are dispersed, I think that's the challenge. Are those resources being dispersed in a way and for the purpose for which they're intended? And so I think there's a separate issue of whether the finance is being given to a particular country. But I think in all of our economies, once the money is dispersed, it isn't always going to the projects. I think that's what we heard from UNDP to where they should be allocated.
Okay, we have very quick answers, Francine, and then Mouhamadou.
Okay, just very quickly on two questions. So first on the question from the lady regarding democratic backsliding. I think even in autocratic contexts, it's still really important to work with the government on trying to build their understanding of the importance of democracy. It's important to work on data to make sure you're able to provide evidence and monitor the situation. And it's really important to work with civil society on building up capacity to engage. On the question from the gentleman here about the link between climate and climate financing and corruption, if I understand where you're coming from, yes, of course, a big challenge is attracting climate financing. So we just came out of a SIDS conference where clearly countries are, you know, in a terrible situation. They're facing the brunt of climate change, and yet, because oftentimes they're middle-income countries, they don't have access to concessional finance that they need to make the upfront investment in green transition, in disaster preparedness, and so on. So absolutely, countries need more financing, and that's why I mentioned the Financing for Development Conference, the 3 COPs, and so on, and the Summit of the Future, which is about reform of the financial architecture, because we need that change. But on the other hand, you know, there is a rush, there is much more upfront investment needed in the green transition, and as that happens, especially with the work with the private sector, it is important that there is data, it is important that there is oversight, and that those tools that are available to do oversight of how those funds are implemented are actually used. I mean, I cited the Transparency International stat of between 1.4 and 35% of climate funds are lost to corruption. I mean, the fact that that is such a huge range means we just don't know, right? So we need better data to monitor really what's happening with those climate funds to ensure that they're spent properly. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'm going to give one last comment to Mr. Mouhamadou, and then we do have an announcement before we wrap up for lunch.
No, just very quickly, along the same lines, I think on the climate issue, I would separate the frustration related to developed countries not living up to their commitments, and that is a legitimate concern. Nobody is denying it. I think it's been acknowledged that far more needs to be done. The whole principle of polluters should be payers, and there are a lot of commitments that have been made over time that hadn't been fulfilled. But that's a different issue, the issue of flow of funds and how do we fund the issues of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. That is separate to me from the issue of do we acknowledge that there are significant corruption risks associated to climate, aside from the issue that's already been highlighted about the fact that there will be significant amount of funds, and you've just heard a percentage, and there could be any number of metrics as to how much of that money could be misused But even setting aside that issue of misuse of funds, I think it's undeniable that there are some corrupt practices that contribute to actually the creation of the climate issue itself. When you think about the issue of, for example, paying bribes to obtain illicit permits, for example, the overexploitation of certain protected areas, that's clearly a climate issue that nobody can deny. When you look at certain interest groups, for example, that are so powerful, almost tantamount to state capture, that undermine environmental regulation, that does contribute to the problem. So I think corruption is part of the problem, and one of the problems that we definitely need to address, as there is significant funding that will be going into climate, how do we make sure that those resources are used for the intended purposes? So I think the nexus is real, and we should not allow the frustration about the financing issues overlook the real issues around fraud and corruption related to climate.
Thank you so much. Oh, Secretary General, one more comment, then we're going to switch gears.
Really, very shortly, since I addressed the backsliding, I wanted to come back, and I completely agree with what was said. In the Council of Europe, we have standards, and this is what we always do. We insist on engaging with all actors, absolutely not only governments, but civil society and all who are engaged on the issues. And actually, what we call our governments and others is implementing standards. And I think that's what was across the board, that we very often have very good tools, but our governments don't need them, don't use them. And young people, I think that's crucial, and sorry not mentioning it, I should have been the first to do it, because the Council of Europe started back in '72 with co-gestion system with young people. And over the years we have evolved, and today we really have both youth perspective and try to push and break or change the rules of some institutions that are rather not open to others to be included. I start with civil society, but with young people in particular. So what we are trying to do to push more youth perspective with youth engagement on policy making. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up. Thank you so much to our panelists. To our audience, if you didn't get a question in, you can check out their names on the website. Some of them have other panels. But thank you all so much for joining us for this opening. And we do have a special video announcement now from the President of Guatemala.
First of all, allow me to apologize for not being able to accompany you in Vilnius today, as was my intention. But very urgent matters that require my personal attention, actually a crisis derived from corrupt businesses from previous administrations, required my presence in Guatemala these days. I congratulate Transparency International for celebrating this important event and express my warm wishes to all participants. In general, we understand the challenge as one of transforming social and political practices to root out corruption and consolidate rule of law through a strategy combining judicial, social, educational, and political approaches. Other key features of this approach would be a focus on the truth. We need to uncover the full extent of corruption and how it impacts individuals and communities. This involves comprehensive investigations and public hearings where victims can share their stories and be acknowledged as such. By doing so, we honor the suffering and ensure that the truth is not buried. Making evident the harm corruption causes to the life of every citizen is critical to mobilize political agency against it. The recovery of stolen assets. We must identify and retrieve assets stolen or acquired through corrupt practices. This requires us to strengthen our legal frameworks for asset recovery and enhancing international cooperation to trace and reclaim assets obtained through corrupt practices. These resources should then be redirected towards development projects that benefit the citizens, our heroes in this story. We need a vision beyond incarceration. We try desperately to fight power head-on, but power often fights back with twice the strength and without playing fair. Carceral approaches punish the corrupt and are necessary, but do not pay back the people with a new fresh page. While it is essential to hold corrupt individuals accountable, we must also explore alternatives to imprisonment that can be more effective in promoting rehabilitation and reconciliation. We need delivering development dividends. The fight against corruption must not hinder the functioning of the state. We need to pursue justice while ensuring that government services continue to be delivered efficiently, as people will measure the effectiveness against corruption in the improvement in public services they see around them every day. We must not be hesitant to govern effectively, to actively change people's lives. A state like ours has abandoned its most vulnerable population for a long time now. And it is time to use these institutions as the instrument to deliver what the people need and deserve. Throughout this approach, it is important to keep in mind that these key features should build towards guarantees of non-recurrence. They may all require institutional reform, which in turn necessitates political commitment and maturity to try, revise our work, and try again. Electing an anti-corruption government in another ways corrupt context is in a way betting against the odds. It requires determination, commitment, and creativity to overcome the many challenges co-opted institutions will continue to present to reformers. Our government is carrying on in this effort, conscious of the mandate given to us by the people and ready to make it true. We know that it is only upon their support and confidence that such ambitious results can be achieved. We are here to serve their will. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the panelists and the moderator of this panel discussion, and also for the welcoming message, President-elect of the Republic of Guatemala, Bernardo Arévalo, for his welcoming speech. As we are about to almost go for lunch, there are some points that I would like to mention. Just a couple of minutes. If you could bear me, we will soon go to lunch. Lunch is almost ready for you. There are just some important announcements, one of which is the app. Some of you are using it. If you are not yet, do it. Create your own agenda. There are all of the updates there, and meet your colleagues from all over the world. The QR codes are all over the place. Just scan them and you'll get to the app. And if you're planning your day already, for the evening, there are two options that you would have. 6:30, the evening program will start at Hall 1. This is the next building. Spectacular evening program awaits. Do plan to be there. But there will also be a masterclass at the same time happening here at 6:30. How to rock the world when you start out with no resources, turning lone wolves into the global anti-corruption wolf pack. And that will be delivered by Gerald Ryle of International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He will be the speaker, and this will be happening at the plenary hall. So two options, you either choose one or you can probably combine both. So this is at 6:30 in the evening. Lunch location, Hall 4, when you get out, it will be right near. 3 p.m. we meet back here, that means in roughly an hour and 15 minutes, for the plenary one on kleptocrats, criminals, traffickers, and accomplices. So we have a good hour, nearly an hour and a half for lunch. Do enjoy it, do enjoy your day, and do come back here at 3 p.m. And thank you so much for listening to all of this. See you soon.